the network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
Hello, welcome to XR Star, your monthly podcast where we talk all things extended reality and metaverse. I'm your host, futurist Amelia Kallman. When it comes to the medical field, there's been over 30 years of academic research and over 3,000 clinical studies done to explore how XR technologies could improve our healthcare systems. Combined with improvements in networking, headsets, and affordability, signs indicate that this industry is getting ready for rapid XR adoption, with NASDAQ projecting the sector to be worth $30 billion by 2026. With use cases in learning, training, marketing, mental health, physical therapy, and disease awareness, XR is in this sector has the ability to not only reduce costs, but ultimately to save lives and make quality healthcare accessible to everyone. VR training by surgeons improved their overall surgical performance by 230% compared with traditional training methods. Just last month, a team of brain surgeons in London collaborated, trained, and advised a medical team in Rio on how to separate twin 3-year-old boys who were conjoined at the head with intertwined brains. Using 3D models and virtual reality simulations, surgeons were able to practice the complex operation under the guidance of the London team who had experience with this unique kind of operation. I'm happy to report that the surgery was successful and the twins are doing fine. VR for mental health, which we'll be focusing on today, can be delivered at scale to patients in their own homes, proving effective in the treatment of PTSD, phobias, neurodevelopmental disorders, social anxiety, psychotic disorders, depression, and eating disorders. VR allows therapists to control the environment, extent, and intensity of the exposure. To diagnose dementia, clinics currently have the option to rely on written cognitive tests or extracting spinal fluid, which is extremely painful and expensive. Now, scientists at University College London and the University of Cambridge have developed a VR navigation test in a simulated environment that is able to detect early signs of mild cognitive impairment at a fraction of the price. VR is also being used as a tool in fitness, meditation, and as a means to alleviate loneliness, all things that ultimately improve mental health. With XR providing proven value in an already strained sector, this is one industry that will be revolutionized by XR technologies. To share more with us about how VR is impacting the future of mental health and the healthcare industry, I am delighted to welcome Nina Salomons, filmmaker, diversity advocate, and the co-founder and CEO of Anomi, a platform that utilizes immersive technologies such as VR to create positive narratives and bring mental health care into the future. Welcome, Nina. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to talk about this.
Yeah, me too. So just to begin, for those people who don't know you yet, can you share a bit about your background and how you got started in the XR industry?
Sure. So my name is Nina Salomons, and I come from a background of filmmaking. I did filmmaking for 5 years. I studied it. I made a lot of documentaries, branded content. And then I discovered augmented and virtual reality, and I loved it. I really wanted to be part of it. I really wanted to understand what it was like, but I also wanted to create a safe space. This was pre-Weinstein, pre-#MeToo, all of that stuff was happening. So I set up the Women in VR meetup group in London in 2016, and I also led the VR Diversity Initiative and the XR Diversity Initiative to bring underrepresented groups into the space. So that's people of color, women, lower income, disabilities, LGBTQ, people over 60 who are struggling to find work. That was really to avoid pre-existing problems that existed in the film and the TV, the gaming, and the tech industry, just to make it more diverse, inclusive, and accessible. I'm currently working on bringing VR into prisons for well-being. And of course, I set up Anomi in the pandemic, and that is really what I'm focusing on at the moment. It's all about helping therapists and coaches have clients create their virtual worlds to express how they're feeling without words. So that's who I am.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, your work in inclusion and diversity is so vital, and I want to hear more about that. I'm going to ask you some questions about that in a minute. But I want to go back to Anomi, which is such an amazing project. And you said that you started it during the pandemic. Wonder if you can share a bit about how it began, what it is, and where it's at today.
Sure. So this actually goes back to the work that I've been doing with prisons in the UK. So I was hired to bring virtual reality in, and the idea was to use it for training and help prisoners understand potentially soft skills for like jobs, for interviews, what it would look like, or what would it be like to be on a construction site, what they'd have to do. But really, initially, it was used for incentivization. So increase attendance for workshops, and we would be doing that through mindfulness, through meditation, escapism. And this was very successful. Attendance at workshops increased by 14.62% in 2016. And a lot of prisoners said that they believe that VR reduced violence. And a lot of them also said it decreased their thoughts of suicide and self-harm. And that really made me start thinking about, okay, well, what kind of safe space could we create for prisoners to understand how they're really feeling and get them out of the loop of returning to prison. And so at that moment, I was thinking, safe spaces, what could they look like? And really, I have no idea. It's all up to them. They have their own personal safe spaces. And at the time, I was making some branded content for free. I was doing a mixed reality shoot where we asked, say, a 7-year-old girl and a 78-year-old man what their safe space could be. We did it in mixed reality, and the impact that it had on them was remarkable. And I thought, okay, so safe spaces. And at the time, I'd also helped the Grenfell Tower victims. I also got them some VR headsets as well. And the stories I heard from that were remarkable, where a couple who had lost their baby in the fire hadn't really done therapy, and they didn't know or want to talk about it. So they actually went down to the community center where there was a therapist in the room, and they had tilt brush. And together they started drawing their grief of losing their child. And that started a conversation. And then the pandemic happened. And all of the work in the prisons kind of was put on hold. But it really made me think about, okay, all of us right now, collectively, we're going through collective trauma. And there's a lot of negativity. What can we do to create something positive? And virtual reality seemed like a really great way of doing that, bringing different people from around the world to express how they're feeling negatively, but also what they were doing to become more positive. And that was all about storytelling. So I then started experimenting with different people online, and I realized that storytelling was very similar, that this negative to positive storyline that we're telling ourselves is very close to therapy, close to coaching. And back in 2020, I got COVID myself, and a lot of nurses and doctors, everyone around me just didn't believe that I was struggling with COVID. It wasn't something that you could see. And it was really frustrating because it had a huge emotional, psychological, physical impact on me. And luckily I had a therapist who was remote. And so I asked her if I could use virtual reality to try and explain what was happening. And I have done therapy for a long time, and it takes a long time to get any breakthrough. But the most remarkable thing happened in this experimentation with my therapist. I was able to explain what was happening without using any words. And I was doing that in virtual reality. And I was getting almost like 4 breakthroughs a session. Instead of 1 breakthrough, maybe in 6 sessions, I was getting 4 in 1. It was almost happening too quickly. And she barely said anything. It was me realizing a lot of the things myself. And I was like, oh, this could be great for the prisoners. And then I was like, actually, well, no, wait a second. This could be great for young people who are really struggling right now. And then I was like, well, actually, this is great for anybody. What am I saying? And so that's how the startup was created. I found my co-founder online via Twitter when we were exploring different social VR spaces. And we started experimenting, and he realized himself too. He came from construction. The power of being able to create a virtual world yourself and have a therapist or a coach guide you in changing that mentality, that self-belief you have about yourself. That really, he understood that. And so it's been really an incredible journey. We've gone through an accelerator. We set up as a company. We won 2 Innovate UK grants, and we're building and testing at the moment.
Amazing. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story with us. I think it's really inspiring and a really beautiful sentiment, too, that this is something that everyone could get something out of. And one thing that really strikes me is that idea that you don't have to use words, because being able to almost physically express something and create something is so powerful, and something that maybe we don't use or utilize enough in our regular, what we think about as traditional mental health facilities and training. So, and you touched on it a bit, but wonder if you could go a bit more in depth to what the tools are that VR can offer us when it comes to mental health that we don't have access to otherwise.
So I'm going to quote a lot from this book that I absolutely love. It's called VRX, How Virtual Therapeutics Will Revolutionize Medicine. And it's written by Brennan Spiegel, who's the director of health services research. And there are so many different things that VR can bring to mental health care. For us, specifically when it comes to using virtual reality instead of words, is when we communicate. When you and I use words to communicate, I can try to describe to you what happened. But when you're talking about people who've been traumatized, or young children who might not be able to describe really what was happening, or you've got something that's happened, but you don't actually have the words to describe how you're feeling it in your body or what it was really like. When we use our hands, or when we build it in virtual reality, and this is something that you see a lot in Minecraft, or something that you might see in Fortnite, where you're building and creating something. It's a language where we don't need words, and that's kind of the beauty of what we're building. We're going to integrate music and dance as well. So there's other ways of communicating with each other. And I grew up in 9 different countries, and there were so many places where I just could not communicate with a person. And the only way I could do that was trying to use my hands, trying to, create something in the sand and draw it with a stick. And that's something that, I think maybe poetry and language, it's beautiful, but there's so much miscommunication that happens as well. And so there's other ways of communicating that are more effective. But I'll just have a beautiful quote here from Brennan Spiegel, which is, "I've managed thousands of patients using countless treatments, but short of performing emergency maneuvers to restart someone's heart, I cannot think of many other treatments in my doctor toolkit that provide so much benefit in so little time as virtual reality." I just think that's so powerful. And VR has been used for so many different things. I mean, I can name like 20 here, from like anxiety, phobia, to chronic pain, to psychosis, to panic disorder, phantom limb pain, fibromyalgia. There's so much. And what VR allows us to do that you can't do in real life is you can use it to access your internal reality. Now, that's something very, very powerful. And when it comes to treatments or mental health, VR is particularly useful to treat patients who are resistant to traditional exposure. And now here I'm going to give you some very other interesting quotes if you'd like. So VR is equal to psychedelics in impact and lasts just as long. And so, for example, if you use VR for PTSD, there's a reduction of those symptoms that are maintained for 6 months. Virtual embodiment itself, so that that's extremely powerful for virtual reality, and it can lead to emotional, cognitive, and behavioral changes. So VR has like this embodied cognition effect on the body and mind. So you can reduce psychological symptoms, but also physiological symptoms. So if you use VR for treatment, for example, your startle response and your stress hormones for 12 months after treatment are reduced, which is incredible. And you know, there's a lot of stuff happening now with psychedelic treatments, and I'm all for it. I think it's great. If something helps you and can change your life for the better, so be it. But I think that with virtual reality, there's more control over what happens. And so with psychedelics, I think it's losing control, but with VR, it's taking back control. I think those are sort of the two differences. And what we're doing with Anomi is we're not creating something that's hyper realistic. VR doesn't have to be very real to elicit a real response. So Slater, he did a study where he found that the higher quality rendering, so real-time ray tracing, light field-based method, compared to lower quality rendering, did not influence the response of participants. So it just shows you that it doesn't need to be highly realistic to have a real impact on the user, which is great. And VR, I'll give you like some examples of where VR can be used specifically for pain and distraction. So there are more neurons dedicated to our vision than to the other senses that we have, such as touch, taste, smell, and hearing. So this is why virtual reality itself is very impactful. And when it comes to pain and distraction, VR shifts your attention. So our brains are continuously looking for new information to, forage food. And you can stop the pain coming to the prefrontal cortex by taking control of the brain processing power, like hijacking it with basically visual stimulation. So when it comes to distraction or pain, so if for example, you're giving birth and you're having a lot of pain, or if you're feeling a lot of pain throughout your body, with virtual reality, you can essentially hijack that brain, and then that pain disappears in the body. So they discovered that even with the most severe pain, those who use virtual reality, like 7 out of 10 had reduced pain. So this is from things such as cancer, gastrointestinal problems, orthopedic issues, neurological pain. I had a woman come up to me who she'd given birth and she was unable to walk afterwards. So she did about 6 months of treatment in the hospital, and she was able to stand up, and it was so painful for her. And she went to the Saatchi & Saatchi gallery, and by this time she was able to put on the backpack. And this is, the sensory experience where you're breathing with all the people around you, and there's this beautiful tree, and you're just particles floating through space. And she said, all of the pain in my body disappeared. It went away. And the moment I took it off, the pain came back. Like, what was that? What happened? And really, that's the power of virtual reality. If you're in severe pain, if you're about to go into a severe surgery or treatment, VR could be a great way to help distract you and take away that pain. So that's just an example of how powerful virtual reality can be.
Yeah, and creating those new neuron networks. So, when you have the pain, if it begins to become associated with something positive or a visual or like, your safe space or something, then that can have that psychological alleviation from the pain as well. And one thing that struck me too, when you were talking about it, so if, I imagine with something like Tilt Brush, when you have the controllers and you're creating something, it's almost like you are physically releasing something. You are physically putting something out there and creating it, and then that is like a reflection back to you. So I can really understand how this could lead to multiple breakthroughs and kind of accelerate that entire process. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I did a session with a movement therapist, and that was so strange. I was not expecting it, where I was in the body. I'd created myself physically in T position. And then she asked me to move away from this body, this pain that I'd created in my body. and just physically moving away from it removed some of the pain in my body. It was such a, I don't know how to describe it except like a trip. It just seems so surreal, but there's so much that you can do physically that, you know, in therapy, you sit down on a chair, but when you're doing virtual reality, you're physically moving and you're asking yourself, like, how are you breathing as you're creating this? Or where do I feel this in the body? Can you create it? Can you move away from it? Can you roll around it? Can you touch it? Can you make it smaller? There's all these things that, you know, it's not the same if you were to do it just like in person.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. Really interesting. So I wanted to ask you too, if you are seeing this being adopted in the medical industry, if there's kind of areas that people are already using VR in. I mentioned the surgery example before. Where do you think the opportunities for implementation are already happening, and what kind of adoption rate are you seeing with these technologies in the healthcare and mental health industries?
Sure. So actually, Oxford VR recently just did the largest clinical trial using virtual reality for mental health. They did 6 weeks of automated VR treatments with CBT. This was used in conjunction to standard of care drug treatment. So it wasn't just VR by itself, it was part of a whole treatment. And the benefits of it were amazing for people who had schizophrenia or mood disorders with psychotic symptoms. And they did this both at home as well as at their local mental health clinic. And yeah, the results were astonishing, and it showcased that virtual reality can really be used. They're using that with sort of automated CBT treatment, whilst I think a lot of the existing VR mental health like startups that exist out there, a lot of them have pre-gamified scenarios. So it's i.e., are you scared? We're going to put you in this storyline and you're going to have to go through it, and every person goes through the same thing. So I think Anomi is very different in that sense. So the way that we have to go through the barriers for implementation of bringing this in are, one, getting FDA approval, going through clinical trials, getting a medical grade device ready. Even so, I actually had a really long debate with the NHS because I said I'm a communication tool. And they said, no, you are a medical grade device. And the reason why you are a medical grade device is because you're being used to help with treatment. And also you are completely changing the environment of your clients. They are not at home on a Zoom call. They are, you know, wherever they choose to be, in a safe space or someplace very different. And one of the things that we say with Anomi is, you know, we want there to be a certified professional with you, because doing this by yourself, it's just not safe enough. It's too it's too powerful. It just has too much impact. I know that sounds very strange. But yeah, so our biggest obstacles really, if we think about implementation of this, are actually, one is the cost of the headsets, the distribution of the hardware across the institutions, the hospitals, the charities, whatever they are, proving that this treatment is effective, because there are many different ways and many different forms of software content that people are using. Clinical trials are also very costly. They take a lot of time. And not only that, we've also now obviously got a lack of staff. We've got a lot of burnout after the pandemic, and there's a lot of cut of wages. If we're talking about the economic climate that exists now, are the staff capable, trained, and able to administer VR safely and effectively? So altogether, bringing VR into these settings, it's going to take some time for everyone to adopt it. But I think there's a lot of countries who have smart hospitals, smart institutions that are very willing and open to innovation. And those countries and those organizations, I think, will be spearheading this change.
And one thing that made me think of when you were talking about it is, like, what happens when the headset comes off? That idea that you need to have another person there to kind of bring it around full circle, you know, because all the things that you learn when you're in that space, you know, ultimately our reality isn't virtual. Our reality is in this body in these environments and stuff. And I think that's such an important point. And just wondering if there are risks when it comes to using these technologies in mental health that we need to be aware of.
I can only speak for my own software. I can't speak for all of the other companies that out there using VR for mental health. But one of the things that we have to make sure is that the clients are onboarded properly, so that if there is a risk of them tripping or hitting walls, they understand that there needs to be a safe space for this. There needs to be a lot of physical space for it as well. For us, the bandwidth and high bandwidth, low latency is required. One of the reasons for this is it's just very annoying. If you have a Zoom call that cuts out, that's quite annoying. But when you're doing therapy and you're doing it and you're fully immersed, that's even more annoying. So a slow frame rate, actually, you have a higher risk of cyber sickness. And cyber sickness basically occurs in less than 5% of patients using VR. And then there's also that women actually have a higher chance of getting cyber sickness as well. So there's those are some risks involved. Seizures, if you do experience seizures, VR, putting two screens with lots of flashing lights in front of you might not be the best thing for you as a treatment. And when we talk about just, being online, I don't think you can put like a pop-up store inside a metaverse at the moment that is like your VR therapy room, because there's a lot of questions around safety online, physical, emotional harassment, data, who owns your data, all of your movements, how you move, how quick you move, where you're looking, how fast you're looking, privacy, like, who's recording all of this information. So there are a couple of risks that exist when you are by yourself. There's a couple of risks when you are online, and when you are doing it, like the reason why we want to create this where we're basically enhancing the use of this with a certified therapist or coach is because, we believe that human element is essential. It's very, very important to create that relationship with another person, to feel heard. I personally don't think talking to a AI, even if it is doing the right questions, I think there's so much more nuance, and there's so much more that can be read between the lines that I don't think AI is capable of, especially when it comes to understanding language and storytelling and picking up what there is in between. So we want to empower therapists and coaches, was I think potentially some of the things that exist out there. There is a risk that, especially if it's enhanced by AI, how is that data being used? Are there biases that exist inside of that as well? So there are risks there, yeah.
And there's just a lot of questions and things that we don't know yet, because this is a new industry, and you're a pioneer in this industry, which I think is really exciting. One thing I wanted to ask you about, though, is I know, it's really important to both of us when it comes to inclusion and diversity and thinking about how we can be inclusive by design, and wondering what advice you have for companies when it comes to taking this into consideration and developing activations and spaces. What do companies need to prioritize and think about when it comes to inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, I'm extremely, extremely passionate about this. It's something that I really, really care about. The reason why is because I think that if you've been in an industry or a sector for too long, you become tunnel visioned in believing that there's only one way and that's the only way. Whilst if you bring in people with different perspective, different ideas, different ways of experiencing the world, that's where true innovation will come. So I believe that if possible, hire an inclusive team as much as possible as you can. Try to, find someone who's enthusiastic, passionate about your idea, and just, if you can afford it, just upskill them. Try to do regular accessibility hackathons, and have end users, even before you launch a product activation, just make sure that you're designing it with, different end users. So make sure you've got a diverse audience. One of the things that I always say is, think about the height of the user, think about the buttons or the controllers. Maybe if you're putting this out for not hospitals or museums, maybe small children's hands can't reach the button at the top. What are you going to do then? Some people might be colorblind. If you're creating something that has specific colors that mean something, if someone's colorblind, they're not going to be able to see it. Spatialized subtitles. This is very, very difficult for immersive tech that has to deal with different languages, especially if it's reactionary subtitles. That's very expensive to code in. And just don't reinvent the wheel. There's so much resources out there, and there's a huge community of people who care about accessibility and inclusion. And when I've run any accessibility sprints, I always love to hear the feedback where people realize that actually building with accessibility and inclusion in mind actually makes their experience richer, and it fixes a lot of the problems that they didn't actually really think about. One of them, for example, would be the spatialized subtitles and how that could help people who struggle to see certain things. So yeah, design with an inclusive team, and also before you launch, make sure that you test with different end users.
Excellent advice. Thank you. And I want to kind of shift gears for a second. So I thought it was really cool that you guys held an NFT auction as a fundraiser for your startup, and wondering your thoughts on how Web3 technologies can be leveraged now or in the future to create more opportunities for small businesses.
Ooh, loaded question, right? Especially in the space right now. Yeah, I think Web3 is incredibly exciting when it comes to ownership of your data, when it comes to utility and traceability. I think one of the biggest things that I struggle with, especially when it comes to healthcare, is there's a lot of companies who don't talk to each other. And so you have to, do you want to share the data with them? But you can't do that. If you were to use Web3, you can do that on the blockchain and you can make it anonymous, but you still have proof of ownership. And I think that when it comes to what we were trying to do with our fundraising event or our auction is, if you have a community with a specific problem that they want to get funded, or that there's a big cause that they care about, it's empowering this decentralized community to create the features that they want, that they require, that they need for a specific problem they might have. And almost like Kickstarter, it really empowers the end user because you're building a product with value. And I think that when it comes to what Web3 is doing, there's maybe potentially other ways of financing and funding that didn't exist before. So if there's a consortium of pharma, research companies, universities, institutions, potentially sharing different pools of funding in order to get a product made. And so, yeah, the Web3, if you have a strong community and if you have a real cause and a real impact, I think is the key term that I'm looking for, then maybe the Web3 and the blockchain and sort of decentralized communities will actually empower you, because it's building something that brings so much value. It gives so much back to the community as well as back to the company. So that's where I'm excited about what Web3 can offer.
Yeah, no, so many possibilities. And I guess that kind of leads into my next question, which is, what do you think XR in healthcare is going to look like 10 years from now?
Where am I going to be in 10 years? This is such a tough question to answer. I think XR in general will just become more integral to our lives in the same way that we carry around our phones, that we have a laptop at the moment. I think, it'll be used at home, at school, at gyms, at institutions. It'll be just a new way of communicating with one another. I definitely think it'll be used for training. Augmented reality will, I think, have a stronger use case for more things, especially when it comes to training or doing things. But VR, I think, has a huge benefit when it comes to taking either a surgeon or a patient to another place. And I know there's a crossover, mixed reality, and there will be AR and VR will be quite interchangeable by that time, I reckon. But, you know, potentially with that will come spatial audio, other senses. I think there will be so many different technologies that will be integrated with one another, and they'll be talking and speaking to each other. It'll be like a web of roots, all sort of connected to each other. That's what I think might happen, as long as the companies are open to it and there is benefit to it. It kind of reminds me of like the roots of trees talking to each other, or like little mushrooms and bees, you know, some kind of cohesive community of technology healing and providing some form of community as well.
That's a lovely visual for that. Thank you. And so my final question for you is, when you think about the bigger picture of XR, metaverse, blockchain, Web3, all these AI even, what is your biggest hope for the future? And then what is your biggest fear?
So I think we're going to start with the biggest fear first, so we can end on a high note. But fear,
Yep.
I think it's quite obvious from the conversation that we've been having, is I am very concerned about the ethics, the safety, the data. I think Web3 sprung out from this idea, this frustration of not being able to control, you know, who you are, your data, essentially. And I have hopes for Web3, but I'm also afraid that it will be turned, manipulated, as it kind of is at the moment, and that data will be used against you. There's a lot of information that can be taken from you through wearable tech. I mean, look at the smartwatches that we have right now and the information that is being uploaded to a cloud of some kind. It's having such personal information, and that's something that I am 100% aware of. You know, we have to make sure that we are compliant, GDPR, we are protected, we keep everyone anonymous. My biggest fear is that that information will be sold and used against you in some way, shape, or form, and you won't know about it. I think that is a form of mass manipulation, and I think it's in some ways quite unethical. And I mean, we can argue the same thing about cookies and other forms of manipulation that exist right now. But yeah, I can't remember if there's anybody out there, but it just shows my age. But when YouTube was young, I was a young YouTuber before YouTube was a thing. So before Google bought YouTube, I was doing YouTube videos, and what existed out there was exciting. It was fun. And I suppose the reason why it was fun was because there was no regulation. There has to be regulation, 100%, but it cannot stifle creativity, originality, new ideas and concepts that could enhance us as a people. So that is my biggest fear. And in terms of hope, I hope the future is accessible, inclusive, and that you can click on and off different buttons, and no matter who you are, what you are, you will feel like you are part of humanity. You are part of us as a people, as a whole on this earth. And I really hope that the future allows communities to feel both safe, heard, that they're ethical, and in some ways that whenever you interact with the metaverse or with VR, AR, whatever it may be, that you find out a little bit more about who you are and what you want to be. You get to truly be yourself, whatever that is, in whatever shape or form. I hope you find authenticity and a little bit of yourself.
And that's a lovely sentiment to end on. Thank you so much, Nina. So for people listening who want to find out more about Anomi, or where they can be in touch or follow you, where should they do that?
Well, please follow us on Twitter. We're still quite small. That's because we're still quite young. So it's at Anomi XR. So ANOMIE XR. It's like it sounds like I know me. That's really what we're going for, but it's not spelled like that. You can also find me on Twitter at Nina_Salomons, SALOMONS. LinkedIn, you can find me on LinkedIn And actually, we also have an Anomi Discord channel. So if you are a therapist, a coach, someone working in the mental health space or an institution, a school that is interested in using Anomi, please do get in touch. We are also looking for a team that is passionate about this. So developers who are interested in this space, please do get in touch. I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to speak to you. And please do reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nina. And thank you all so much for watching and listening. See you again soon. Take care.